Welcome to the Freehof Institute of Progressive Halakhah video shiur, the Halakhah and Organized Labor. What does Jewish law teach about labor unions? Are workers permitted to organize, take action, go on strike, effectively close down businesses to advocate for their interests, for better wages, for benefits and working conditions? Since organized labor is a feature of modern industrial society, it's a little wonder that our classical halachic sources have little to say about them, if anything. Yet, in modern times, scholars of halakha have learned to read those sources in such a way as to support labor unionization. In this shiur, we'll chart the course of that development, a prime example of how the texts of Jewish law in the right hands can make room for changing times and changing conditions of life. Let's begin with our earliest halachic text, the Mishnah, which speaks most directly to the negotiation of labor contracts in the first Mishnah of Tractate Bava Metzia, chapter 7. Hasocher et hapoalim va'amar lahem lahashkim ulaha'ariv. One who hires laborers and instructs them to arrive at work early and stay late, that is, beyond the usual length of the workday, is not entitled to enforce that requirement in a locale where it is not the custom to arrive at work early and stay late. Moreover, in a locale where it is customary to feed the workers, the employer must feed them. Where it is customary to provide relish or dessert along with the meal, give them something extra, the employer must provide it. Hakol k'minhag hamedina. All is determined by local custom. Now the Mishnah brings a maaseh, or a case. The son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Matya, at the behest of his father, hires some workers and agrees to give them mezonot, to feed them a meal while they're on the job, without specifying the menu. His father's worried. Well, if you promise them mezonot, a meal, without further qualification, there's no limit to the thing. Even Seudat Shlomo, a feast fit for King Solomon in his day, wouldn't be enough because, as descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they are all royalty. So here's what you do. Go back to them before they start the job and define what we mean by mezonot, that all we owe them is pat v'kitnit, bread and beans, the minimal standard for a meal. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Lo hayat tzarich hakol keminhag hamedina. He, that is Yochanan ben Matya, did not have to make that stipulation because all is determined by local custom, which defines the extent of an employer's obligation to feed his workers. Now, we learn from this that minhag, the established local custom or practice, is the controlling factor in determining wages, benefits, and working conditions. And indeed, the Talmud understands the Mishnah in precisely this way. It objects pshita, which is the way the Talmud demands a reason for statements of fact or law that are so patently obvious that we should already know them. In this case, it's obvious that local custom is the controlling factor. So why does the Mishnah, a sacred text that would not waste time and space telling us what we already know, why does the Mishnah bother to inform us of this? Well, as always, the Talmud answers its own objection. Here, the Mishnah is talking about a special case when ditafaloho a'agraiho, the employer decides to pay the workers more than the customary wage. Now, he might think that this gives him the right to insist that in return for the extra money, the workers give him extra work, coming early and staying late. So the Mishnah says, Hakol k'minhag hamedina, to inform us that the length of the workday remains set by local custom, because the workers can claim, yeah, you paid us extra, but you paid us with the intention that we should do better work, but not work longer hours. So minhag remains in control, and apparently nobody is permitted to diverge from it. But about 1,000 years after the composition of the Mishnah, the Northern European Tosafot underlines a major exception to the rule. The Ri, 12th century Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre, explains that the Mishnah refers to a situation in which the employer hired the workers stam, that is, without stipulating anything about working hours, and then, after making the contract, wants to require that they start early and stay late. In such a case, Minhag Hamedina controls and forbids him from making that change. But if the employer makes that tanai, that stipulation from the get-go, and the workers agree, then hakol lefi tanao. It's the stipulation and not the local custom that determines the length of the workday. And the Shulchan Aruch accepts this as authoritative halacha. The employer in the Mishnah cannot require the laborers to work extra hours, kivan shelo hitna ken b'sha'a shescharan, since he did not stipulate to that effect when he hired them. Which means, of course, that if he did make that tanai, the stipulation sets the terms of the contract. Now, notice that these texts say nothing about whether the workers may organize to negotiate with the employer. True, they don't expressly forbid organization, but they view the workers as individuals who can either take it or leave it. They can accept or they can reject the job as it is defined by, well, by local custom or by the employer's stipulation. That is, in accordance with factors beyond their control or beyond their power to influence. But here comes a text that suggests an interesting possibility. In Bavli Bava Batra 8b, we read, Tanu Rabbanan, Ulshayin b'nei ha'ir lahatnot al hamidot v'al ha'sha'arim v'al sachar po'alim ulahasiya al kitzatan. A baraita. The townspeople are empowered to fix weights and measures, prices and wages, and to inflict penalties for the infringement of their rules. And the Shulchan Aruch tells us that this is the accepted halakhah. So we learn that the level of wages, for example, is not set exclusively by long-standing minhag or by the employer's decision. The public, the residents of the community, perhaps acting through a town council, can legislate on these matters and enforce their decisions. Of course, the text does speak of Bnei Ha'ir, the citizens of the town. We don't know yet whether groups of workers can exercise similar power, but maybe they can. Because on the next page of Bava Batra, we find the following case. Hanhu beitre tabache da'avde inyana bahade hadade. Two butchers made an agreement with one another that if either of them operated his business on the other's day, the skin of his beast should be torn up. One of them did operate his business on the other's day, and the skin of his animal was torn up. Now, those who did this came before Rava, and he required them to make restitution. Now, we're on the third line of the Hebrew, well, Aramaic here. Itive Rav Yemar ben Shlamia leRava, ulahasiya al kitzatam. Rav Yemar ben Shlamia objected to Rava. The Baraita, and he's referring to that passage we just read, says that the townspeople are entitled lahasiya al kitzatan, to inflict penalties for the infringement of their rules. In other words, Rav Yemar holds that the power vested in the Bnei Ha'ir, the citizens of the town, is also vested in a group of tradespeople, in this case, the butchers. But Rava did not bother to answer him, which is something of a put-down. And then Rav Papa comes along to say that Rava was right not to answer him, because it's obvious that the Baraita's rule applies only hecha deleka adam chashuv, where there is no distinguished person in the town. But where there is a distinguished person, then they, meaning here the butchers, have no power to make such stipulations. So we learn a couple of things about the power and authority of trade groups. And we're going to let Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, be our guide. He writes in a teshuvah, a responsum, Davar barur hu shehatzibur resha'im ligdol ulitaken takanot v'la'asot haskamot k'fi ma sheyireh be'eneihem v'harei hu kayam kedin Torah. It is a settled matter that the public, that is, the Bnei Ha'ir, is empowered to legislate as they see fit, and that their enactments enjoy the status of Torah law. He continues, likewise, should craft workers in the town, such as the butchers, the dyers, the sailors, and the like, all come to an agreement on any matter related to their craft, their agreement is binding. Shekol chabura shehem b'nei inyan echad, hare ke'il bifnei atzma. For any group whose members share a common interest are considered a town for this purpose. So Rav Yemar is right. The powers vested in the townspeople, the Bnei Ha'ir as a body, are also vested in any sub-community within the town that share a common interest. But, Rashba says, Rava is also right. This applies only if a Torah scholar or other Adam Hashuv, a distinguished person appointed as a public official in the town, should ratify their agreement. Now, why do the rules adopted by a trade group need the approval of an Adam Hashuv when the rules adopted by the Bnei Ha'ir do not? The Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, offers an explanation in his Chidushim, his commentary to Bava Batra. Mishum dilma ika pesida lalukuchot de miyakre zevine. Hilkach lav tana'ahu ad deshakle reshut mine. Since consumers stand to lose from increased prices, that is, the butcher's stipulation, has no force unless they have received authorization from him, from the Adam Chashuv. An important point, the public, the consumers, have a stake in the decisions adopted by trade groups. Any rule that places a restraint upon trade, for example, a rule that only one butcher is allowed to work in the town on a particular day, that rule is liable to lead to price increases that, of course, affect everybody. So, to safeguard the public interest, the approval of some recognized local authority is required in order that the rule may go into effect. Now, what kind of authority are we talking about? The Shulchan Aruch calls him a Chacham Chashuv, literally a distinguished sage who is appointed as a public official. By sage, does he mean rabbi? Well, we'll deal with this later. Important to note here is that the Shulchan Aruch uses the label Ba'alei Omanut, craft workers, skilled artisans, to describe those who are empowered to adopt these rules, which raises the question, do these sources offer support for labor unionization? And the answer is not necessarily. Artisans, Ba'alei Omanut, are usually understood in the tradition as independent, self-employed business people whose organizations resemble the medieval trade guilds. The sources are not talking about poalim and pikidim. They're not talking about laborers or office workers hired by an employer, a Baal Habayit. Like those poalim that we met in Mishnah Bava Metzia, those people are not Ba'alei Omanut. Are they entitled to form their own associations to represent them in contract negotiations, to make rules, to enforce demands, to strike? The Mishnah doesn't say so. The other sources don't say so. At least they don't say so explicitly. For that conclusion, we'll have to turn to poskim, the halachic authorities of the 20th century who confront labor unionization as a live reality. Poskim such as Rabbi Ben Sion Meir Hai Uziel, who served as the first Sephardic chief rabbi of the state of Israel. Rav Uziel is a fascinating figure, the scion of a Sephardic family of many generations in Eretz Yisrael, a traditional rabbi who was also an active Zionist and participant in the movement to establish a sovereign Jewish state. As such, he was one of those Orthodox halachic scholars who devoted much time and energy to updating the Halakhah, to making the traditional sources yield practical guidance on a range of modern questions. And one of those questions is labor relations. In 1937, Rav Uziel received a she'elah, an inquiry from the executive committee of Hapoel HaMizrachi, the labor arm of Hatzionut HaDatit, the Orthodox Zionist movement. As the name implies, it's an organization committed to contemporary labor ideology and to traditional Jewish observance. Its members looked to Rav Uziel to express the stance of the Halakhah on the issue of labor unionization in our time. Now, keep in mind that in 1937, labor unions do exist, and Hapoel HaMizrahi is very much supportive of them. And as we can see from his response to the She'elah, which opens with the words, Achim Yikarim Va'ahuvim, my dear and beloved brethren, Uziel, as a good Zionist, regards this as an organization of his comrades. His challenge, of course, is to make the texts of Halakhah speak directly to the question of organized labor. And let's pick up here with what we're going to call Rav Uziel's leap of interpretation. He begins by citing Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, the outstanding 14th century posek, on the passages that we've read from Baba Batra. Now, like the Rashba, Rosh concludes that any association of tradespeople or craft workers, Baalei Omanut, exercises the same authority as the Bnei Ha'ir, the citizens of a community. They're empowered to make rules governing the conduct of their business, provided that they receive the consent of an Adam Hashuv, whom Uziel describes as Rosh Manhig Ba'ir, a community official. Notably, and unlike the Shulchan Aruch, he does not use the word Chacham in this description, but let's see what happens later. And he emphasizes, V'zohi halakha psuka umachletet she'en aleha machloket. This is the decided halakha over which there is no dispute. Now comes the leap. This undisputed halakha demonstrates that the rabbis explicitly recognized the regulations adopted by Irgun Ba'alei Omaniyut, a guild of tradespeople, like the butchers we've read about in the Talmud, or a union, Histadrut, of blue-collar laborers, Poalim, or white-collar workers, Pekidim, who are organized into one general union or several separate professional associations, unions. Uziel reads the Halakhah to include labor unions, the Histadrut, that gather all workers under the umbrella of this undisputed Halakhah, even though the Talmud and the codes have until now spoken specifically about skilled craft and tradespeople. As we say, that's a leap of interpretation, one that reads into the sources a great deal of content that is not explicitly there. Now, the reason why Uziel makes this leap is that social justice demands it. V'kach hadin noten. It's only right and just that laborers, like artisans, be permitted to unionize, for it is only through unions that they can achieve, as we see on the last line of the Hebrew, yachas mechubad usachar hogen la'avodato, dignity and fair compensation in his work, so that he can support his family at a standard of living equal to that of his fellow community members. Notice that he says B'nai Iro, the workers' fellow community members. The expansion of that Talmudic term B'nai Ha'ir is complete. It now includes all citizens, including the working class, all of whom deserve the same decent standard of living. And like all their fellow citizens, workers also deserve decent cultural, educational, and medical institutions, along with pensions and retirement plans. And here Uziel makes a nice comparison between present-day Poalim and the Levites of biblical times, who retired from their jobs at age 50. The point is that Kol Hadvarim Ha'ele, שאינם יכולים להתמלא אלא בארגון של אומנים או פועלים. None of these ends is achievable without organization by tradespeople, artisans, or laborers. ולכן נתנה תורת ישראל זכות מלאה וחוקית לארגון זה. For this reason, the Torah of Israel grants them the complete legal right to organize, אף על פי שיכולה להיות ממנו הפסד לבעלי בתים, even if this might cause financial loss to employers. Now again, The sources, Torat Yisrael, they do not explicitly say that workers, as opposed to self-employed tradespeople, have a right to organize. But Rav Uziel believes that the demands of simple social justice require this leap of interpretation. It's a sharp critique of pure capitalism or market economics. As human beings, workers must not be left to the caprice of the law of supply and demand. They are entitled to organize so that they can pressure for better wages, better benefits, better working conditions, even if that results in lower profits for employers. But there's a catch. The right of a union to exert pressure is conditional upon the approval of an Adam Chashuv, the distinguished person that we've read about, provided that such a person, whom Uziel calls Manhig v'Shofet HaKehillah, a community official or judge, exists in the community. Now, a while back, we saw that Nachmanides, the Ramban, explained this requirement on the grounds that rules adopted by trade associations cause higher prices for consumers, so that you need this Adam Chashuv to protect the public welfare. Uziel expands upon this idea. The reason for this rule, as he explains in the second paragraph here, is Lefi shekol irgun miktsoi enenu yachol lihyot objektivi b'hachlatotav ela hu subjektivi. No professional organization makes decisions objectively. On the contrary, it is subjective. Its self-interest renders it insensitive to the situation of the employer. Moreover, the formation of labor unions will lead inevitably to the formation of employers' associations, and the two sides will be locked in never-ending hostility. To remedy this, the rabbis required that the union's rules be endorsed by a distinguished person, that is, and we're on the end of the first line of the Hebrew, Chadul beruach haTorah v'hamishpat, v'shehiyeh objektivi legamre. This is a person who is filled with the spirit of Torah and justice, who can consider the claims of both sides with total objectivity and arrive at a just resolution. V'sheyimna al yedei kach kol hishtamshut shel shvita bilti mutzdeket o hishtaltut tzad echad al hasheni. This person can prevent the resort to an unjustified strike or the domination of either side by the other. Uziel's concern clearly extends beyond price inflation. When he calls for justice, he means justice for both sides, for the employer as well as for the worker, and only an objective arbiter can ensure this. And Lefi matzav tana'ei ha'avodah bazman hazeh, given the conditions of labor in our time, no one distinguished person can decide alone on the legality of measures adopted by the workers. So in place of an Adam Chashuv, Uziel calls for a Beit Din Chashuv, a special court composed of Torah scholars and economists, which will determine the structure of labor law and appoint judges to arbitrate every dispute that arises among workers or between workers and employers. The goal is to resolve all disputes so that strikes will be unnecessary and will never happen, because Uziel is opposed to strikes. Lefi oniyut da'ati, she'ashvita bechlal eina muteret, v'lo retzuya lo lapoel v'lo leba'al habayit. In my opinion, strikes are not permitted, and they are undesirable. They involve negative consequences for both workers and employers. The negative consequence of the strike for workers is that it constitutes a violation of the covenant of Sinai. After all, the Torah of Israel instructs us that work is a positive obligation. As it says in the Ten Commandments, Sheshet yamim ta'avod va'asita kol malachtecha, v'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, and the seventh day is a Shabbat to Adonai your God. To which the Midrash says, Kishem shebrit laTorah, kelomar lemitzvat Shabbat shebaTorah, kach brit lamalacha. Just as Shabbat is an obligation of the covenant, so is work, that is, during the 6 work days, an obligation of the covenant. Just as we don't work on Shabbat, we are obliged to work 6 days a week, and a labor strike necessarily transgresses that mitzvah. Uziel's source for this chiyuv, or obligation, may be this passage from the Avot de Rabbi Natan that comments on the statement in the first chapter of Avot, Ehov et hamalacha, love work and hate mastery. The text says, one should love work and not despise it, for just as the Torah was given to us through Brit, the covenant, so was work given to us through the covenant. As it says in Exodus chapter 20, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, and the seventh day is a Shabbat to Adonai your God. Now, we should point out that the poskim, the codes and the halachic authorities, do not pick up on this. They do not rule that there is a chiyuv, an obligation to work 6 days a week that is equivalent to the prohibition against work on the seventh day. The chiyuv that Rav Uziel speaks of here is more a matter of agadah than of halakhah. And really, that's a good thing, because if this so-called obligation were halakhic, how would we square it with the 5-day or 4-day work week? Still, as a statement of values, it's important. According to Uziel's reading, the Torah means for us to engage in productive work, and a strike, however justified from the worker's point of view, necessarily means that they're not working. So that's one reason why strikes are forbidden. They involve negative consequences for workers. But that's just the first part of Rav Uziel's argument. He also says that strikes are prohibited because of their negative consequences for employers. Lefi shekol avodat binyan o ta'asiyah ve'en tzarich lomar nitiyah שלא נעשתה ולא נגמרה בזמנה, הרי היא בגדר דבר האבוד. Because a delay in completing any job in construction, manufacturing, and obviously in agriculture, any delay involves perishable goods, because both because of lost time and because of the damages caused to the employer's materials. Now, what we translate here as perishable goods, it really means anything that is time dependent. The idea touches upon the very foundations of Jewish labor law. As we read in Bava Kama 116b, Amar Rav, Poel yachol lachzor bo afilu b'chatzi hayom, dichtiv, ki li v'nei Yisrael avadim, v'lo avadim la'avadim. Rav said, a day laborer is entitled to quit his job even in the middle of the day, as it is written in Leviticus 25, for the people of Israel are my servants, and not the servants of servants. The word avadim, servants, is also used for slaves, and that's significant. The definition of free labor, as opposed to slavery, is the right to quit one's job whenever one wishes to do so, even before the job is completed. And that's the difference between a free laborer and one who is not free. But there is an essential limitation upon this right to quit. As the Shulchan Aruch puts it, Bameh devarim amurim, badavar she'enu avud. When does this rule, that is, that one may quit before the job is done, when does this rule apply? When the laborer is dealing with non-perishable, that is, non-time dependent items. But when you're talking about davar ha'avud, perishable items, and here he gives us some examples, such as hauling soaked flax or transporting musical instruments for a funeral or a wedding, neither a laborer nor a contractor is permitted to quit before the job is done. Which, when you think about it, only makes sense. If I hire workers for a job that involves perishable items, or for a job that has to be completed on deadline, it's understood from the very beginning that I hired them on condition that they complete the job before quitting. By starting the job, they have agreed to that condition and have effectively waived their right to quit. And that's the accepted halakhah. Rav Uziel's chidush, his original contribution to it, is that lefi tana'ei ha'avodah bizmanenu, barur li hadavar shekol dichui shel avodah, בחקלאות או בתעשייה ובניין גורם הפסדים גדולים שאינם מתמלאים בזמן אחר. It is clear to me that under the conditions of work that prevail nowadays, any delay in work in agriculture, manufacturing, or construction will cause serious and irrevocable loss, and workers have no legal right to cause such losses to their employers. Now, you see where this is going. If everything is devar ha'avud, I mean, if everything is devar ha'avud, perishable, time dependent, then a strike is never permissible. And if it occurs, the workers owe damages to the employer, which can impose a crushing financial burden upon the union. This means, of course, that Uziel effectively denies to labor unions the use of their most potent means of pressuring an employer to reach an acceptable deal. But in his view, workers have nothing to worry about because his Beit Din Chashuv, the special court that would be able to decide on all aspects of labor contracts, that Beit Din Chashuv would protect their legitimate interests. He wants workers to have faith in the objectivity of that court to do what's right. Of course, objectivity is a tall ask of any political institution, which such a court would necessarily be. Without the threat of the strike to back up its demands, the union would be at the mercy of Uziel's Beit Din Chashuv, whose members, as political appointees, might well be hostile to organized labor. But this is not the last word of the 20th century Halakhah on the subject. Explicit support for labor's right to strike comes from another posek, that would be Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who at the time of his death in 1986 was regarded as the preeminent Orthodox halachic authority in North America. Like Uziel, Rabbi Feinstein believes that Jewish law approves of labor unionization. His responsum on the subject cites the same Talmudic and post-Talmudic sources that we've seen in Uziel's statement, including the requirement that the decisions of an organization like a labor union be approved by an Adam Chashuv. But unlike Uziel, Feinstein discusses this ideal requirement in the context of political reality. He writes in his responsum, Ba'arim shebamedina zo lo mimuneh shum chacham al kach. In the cities of this country, meaning the United States, no such sage Adam Chashuv functions in this official capacity. The situation therefore reverts to one where there is no Adam Chashuv, meaning that the union's decisions have legal force. This takes us back to the passage in Bava Batra 9a concerning the butchers who adopted a rule that each member of the group works only on his designated days. Rav Papa says that such a strike is not enforceable without the approval of the Adam Chashuv in town. But if there's no Adam Chashuv in town, then the union's decisions are enforceable, that is, binding on its members, and that would include a decision to strike. Feinstein notes that in this country, there is no sage or agency or special court that functions in the capacity of the Adam Chashuv. So it follows that Jewish law permits unions to strike in any community, virtually every democratic community in the world where no such court of compulsory arbitration exists. But we're not yet out of the woods, because generally, if a strike is to succeed, the union must be able to prevent the employer from bringing in replacement workers or scabs. And it doesn't appear that the Halakhah gives the union that power. Feinstein notes that while the majority of the union's members may require all members to take part in the strike, they don't have that power with respect to workers who are not members of the union. And that sounds fair, but if so, then where is the power in the union's decision to strike? So in the absence of an Adam Chashuv or special court, Feinstein has to solve this problem. And he does. אבל מכל מקום מסתבר שיכולים לחופן. Still, it is more reasonable to conclude that the union members are empowered to keep non-union workers from taking their jobs, literally to coerce them, based on the following three provisions of Jewish law. Number one, din kapasakta lahayuti, the claim that you are interfering with my livelihood. In other words, a rule that restrains or forbids ruinous competition, such as, in our case, the activity of scabs who take the jobs of striking workers. Number two, din ma'arufiyah, a law dating from medieval times that prohibits one from doing business with another merchant's regular or fixed customer. Here, the employer, the Baal Habayit, is the regular customer of the workers. They have an exclusive right to do business, that is, to work for the employer, and non-union members are forbidden to take their place. And number three, inyan hachazakot, the fact that in some instances, one who occupies a position can claim possession or chazakah on that position and prevent others from taking it. Now, the common denominator uniting all these legal institutions, none of which specifically relates to organized labor, is that they grant to individuals in certain circumstances the power to restrain competition when such restraint is deemed vital to their economic interest. The analogy to a union out on strike is obvious. Thus, Rabbi Feinstein believes that he has located support in the Halakhah for unions blocking the hiring of replacement workers. But, and there's always a but, it's far from certain that his argument is successful. There are serious problems that attach to each of these three legal institutions. For example, the claim pasakta lachayuti, you are interfering with my livelihood, is mentioned only once in the Talmud as grounds to prohibit a competing tradesperson from setting up shop in one's neighborhood. But none of the code cites that claim as authoritative halakha. Apparently, the competitor is permitted to move in, even if that competitor reduces the trade of the existing business. The ma'arufiyah, one's regular customer that others are forbidden to do business with, well, that law was enforced in some medieval communities, but it has not been a factor in Jewish business law for many centuries. And it is more than doubtful that a chazakah applies to jobs when a union's contract has expired, and when the workers have rejected the employer's term and are refusing to go back to work. In other words, the workers aren't working, so what chazakah do they have on that job? Rabbi Feinstein has built his case upon three weak foundations. He is struggling mightily to prove that a union has the right under Halakhah to prevent non-union workers from taking jobs during a strike. Perhaps the best we can say for his argument is that it suggests, doesn't prove, but suggests that Jewish law does not make a fetish out of unrestrained competition, that it recognizes the possibility, or at least is open to the possibility, that in certain cases, economic justice demands that competitors be kept out. At any rate, his best argument may be this one, that the common practice in this country is to recognize the right of the union to keep out strikebreakers. Thus, we return to minhag hamedina, the custom of the community, as the factor that determines labor law. He also may be alluding to the principle of dina de malchuta dina, that Halakhah accepts as valid the law of the malchut, the state, certainly in the area of dine mamonot, matters dealing with property, contracts, business, and labor relations. At any rate, we've seen how two eminent Orthodox authorities of the 20th century find clear and even enthusiastic support in the halachic sources for labor organization. And one of these, Moshe Feinstein, states firmly that on grounds of social justice, Jewish law recognizes the right of unions to strike and to keep out replacement workers. And we should also note that the reform movement has taken a similar stand. This CCAR responsum, on the basis of the same sources we've looked at in this shiur, finds unions to be an indispensable tool in the long struggle for social justice and the rights of workers. What all of this demonstrates is the capacity of the Halakhah to grow, to develop, to accommodate changing times and social values. If the original texts and sources do not directly address the reality of organized labor, the fact is that they can address it. The scholars charged with applying those texts to contemporary questions have made them address it. They've made them yield positive and, dare we say, progressive guidance for Jews who seek an ethically satisfying response to the economic and social challenges posed by modern industrial society. And as students of Torah committed to a vision of progressive halakha, we regard them as allies in our struggle for justice. This has been a video shiur, the Halakhah and Organized Labor, from the Freehof Institute of Progressive Halakha.